My dogs answered the 3 a.m. door kick. It was Brenda from the HOA starting a battle over my perfectly parked truck. This HOA war escalated faster than I could have imagined, leading to a showdown. The jarring thuds against my front door ripped me from a deep sleep, shattering the pre-dawn quiet. Was I dreaming? No. A second, then a third violent impact vibrated through the house, rattling the pictures on the wall. Before my feet even hit the floor, my loyal dogs, two powerful German shepherds and our brave rescue mutt, burst to life. Their nails clicked a furious rhythm on the hardwood as they charged the door, barking with a primal intensity usually reserved for intruders. By the time I managed to pull on a robe, their low growls told me they meant serious business. Through the door's top window, a horrifying sight awaited. Brenda, our HOA president, stood there in pink satin pajamas, her hair a wild, chaotic mess, and her face twisted with an almost unholy rage. I cautiously unlatched the chain, opening the door just enough for a sliver of conversation, partly to keep her out, and partly for the sheer amusement of watching her try to peer around it while dodging 3 sets of snapping teeth. Was she really screaming about a violation at this hour, with my furious dogs on alert? Didn't the time or the snarling canines suggest this discussion could wait until the sun rose? She pointed a furious finger at my driveway, insisting my truck was illegally parked. I glanced past her. My truck sat exactly where it always did, perfectly within my property lines, legal and obstructing nothing but her peace of mind. Oh, how she disliked my observation, that her crusade against imaginary offenses must be utterly exhausting. Instead, she demanded I move it immediately, as if I were a child under her personal curfew. My dogs, sensing the escalating tension, lunged at the chain gap, their barks so thunderous that Brenda recoiled, still pointing but clearly losing her self-righteous vigor. I'd be delighted to discuss this during business hours, I calmly stated, but unless this is a true emergency unrelated to my truck, I'm going back to bed. She actually tried to wedge her slipper into the door crack, earning her another cacophony of barks that sent her scurrying to the porch's edge. From there, she launched into a dramatic monologue about property values and community standards, but her eyes kept darting nervously to my dogs, who were practically trembling with eagerness to make her night even worse. I closed the door mid-sentence. I was done listening, yes, but I also wanted to see if she'd dare to escalate from the relative safety of the sidewalk. And wouldn't you know it, through the curtains I watched her stomp to the end of my driveway, pull out her phone and begin snapping pictures like a paparazzi hound, catching a celebrity meltdown. I thought that would be the end of her midnight madness, but barely 30 minutes later, the dogs erupted again. This time I peered out to find Brenda standing there with a flashlight, sweeping its beam across my lawn as if searching for buried treasure. Before my dogs woke the entire block, I stepped outside, lost Brenda, or just auditioning for a low-budget crime drama. She brandished a hot pink piece of paper, claiming it was an immediate action notice from the HOA board. I declined to take it seriously. Who prints legitimate notices at 3 a.m. on bright pink paper? She declared the board had voted to fine me on the spot, and that my continued defiance would lead to dire consequences. Fine, I replied, as long as you can explain to a judge why you were trespassing on my property in the middle of the night to deliver it. Her eyes narrowed. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head. She wasn't accustomed to anyone challenging her authority. She mumbled something about calling the sheriff, to which I cheerfully offered, I'll be happy to offer him coffee when he arrives. When she finally realized I wouldn't back down, she stormed off again, her flashlight beam jerking wildly, too furious to walk a straight line. I remained on the porch for a while, letting the night's peaceful rhythm return. My dogs, sensing the show was over for now, settled by the front door, their tails thumping softly. I knew this wasn't the end. Brenda never left things unfinished, but I never imagined she'd try again before dawn. At 4:15, the crunch of gravel roused me once more. I crept to the window just in time to see Brenda's car creeping down the side of my driveway, headlights off, like a spy on a covert mission. I slipped outside and caught her halfway up my lawn, her phone camera aimed directly at my porch. She froze upon seeing me, but instead of retreating, she doubled down, shouting that my landscaping lights violated the HOA's brightness policy. I pointed out they'd been installed for 2 years without a single complaint. She snapped back that new regulations had passed, apparently between her midnight notice and this pre-dawn recon mission. You're welcome to put that in writing during daylight hours. Like a sane person, I countered. But right now you're trespassing. She let out a short, brittle laugh, claiming HOA rules allowed board members to inspect properties anytime. Show me the rule, I challenged, knowing full well it didn't exist. When she hesitated, I dialed the sheriff's non-emergency line, which seemed to shake her just enough to send her scurrying back to her car. She tried to salvage her dignity with a parting threat about bigger issues I'd soon face, but the way she slammed her car door made it clear this round was mine. As she sped off, two things became clear. She was escalating far faster than I'd anticipated, and I needed to decide how much more I'd tolerate before I shifted from defense to offense. And if there was one thing I'd learned about Brenda, it was that she consistently underestimated those who didn't shout back. The next morning, my greeting wasn't the sunrise or the smell of coffee, but the sound of my dogs losing their minds yet again. It was just after 7 a.m., and after the previous night's chaos, I half expected them to be barking at a floating leaf. But what awaited me on the porch was a new level of absurdity. My truck was still parked in my driveway, exactly where it belonged. But now, a fluorescent orange sticker, the kind you'd see on abandoned cars in a junkyard, was plastered across the windshield. HOA violation, it blared, subject to towing. The fine print cited non-compliance with community vehicle placement guidelines. The only guideline I seemed to be violating was simply existing while Brenda was in a bad mood. With one satisfying rip, I peeled it off and glanced down the street. Sure enough, there she was, at the edge of her own driveway, clutching a clipboard like a sacred scroll, staring at me with a smugness so thick you could spread it on toast. She didn't call out, didn't wave. She just stood there, like a silent, judgmental statue. I offered her a slow, sarcastic salute that clearly conveyed, "I see you and you're absolutely ridiculous." Then I went back inside. My coffee had barely begun brewing when my phone rang, an unfamiliar county number. Against my better judgment, I answered. It was a code enforcement officer, gravely informing me that a formal complaint had been filed. My vehicle was blocking safe egress from the sidewalk. I nearly burst out laughing. My driveway doesn't even connect to a sidewalk. There's a strip of grass in between. The officer's tone suggested he knew this was nonsense, but had to follow protocol. He assured me they'd send someone for a quick check, and it would likely be fine. By 9 a.m., a small county truck pulled up. A polite officer emerged with a clipboard. He looked at my driveway, then at me, then asked, "Do you know someone named Brenda?" I simply gestured toward her house. She was out front again, meticulously sweeping her already spotless walkway. He sighed like a man who'd seen this movie before, snapped a couple of pictures and confirmed there was no violation. Then, almost conspiratorially, he shared that she'd filed 5 separate baseless complaints against various neighbors in the last 2 weeks. All this. Apparently I was just the latest target in her relentless rotation. I hoped that would be the end of her morning antics. But around 11 a.m., I caught movement outside my window. Brenda was marching up my driveway again, this time with 2 other HOA board members in tow. Both men looked utterly miserable, clearly wishing they were anywhere else, but they dutifully trailed behind her as she slapped a folded letter onto my porch railing. I stepped outside, my dogs flanking me like a personal security detail. Another 3 a.m. emergency. "Brenda," I quit. Ignoring my jab, Brenda grandly announced that the HOA had voted to impose a $250 fine for vehicle obstruction, and that failure to pay within 7 days would result in further penalties. "May I see the minutes from this meeting?" I asked, knowing full well HOA votes require documentation. She declared the minutes were confidential, which of course isn't how any of this worked. When I pointed out the procedural flaw, one of the board members shifted uncomfortably, muttering something about needing to leave for work. The other mumbled a hasty goodbye and followed him. Brenda, however, remained rooted, clearly unwilling to let the scene end without a dramatic exit. She leaned in slightly. "I'll be keeping a close eye on your property until this matter is resolved," she warned. "That's perfectly fine," I replied, "but if you step onto my property again without permission, I'll be keeping an eye on you from the comfort of a courtroom." She huffed, spun on her heel and marched away, her pink satin pajamas replaced by bright yellow capri pants that somehow made the whole moment even more surreal. I thought that might be the last I'd see of her for the day. I was wrong. Around 2 p.m., returning from errands, I found a tow truck parked in front of my house. The driver stood beside my truck, scratching his head, while Brenda hovered nearby, clipboard in hand, pointing furiously. I pulled up, parked behind the tow truck, and got out. The driver looked visibly relieved when I asked what was happening. He explained he'd been told my vehicle violated community bylaws and needed towing at the HOA's request. When I asked for the work order, it bore only Brenda's signature, no other authorization. In front of both of them, I calmly explained that the HOA had no authority to tow from a private driveway without a court order or police instruction. The driver, realizing he was about to be caught in an ugly legal mess, handed me the clipboard and said he'd be on his way. Brenda shouted after him that she'd report his refusal to the board, but he merely gave a dismissive wave as he drove off. That should have been a moment of triumph, but Brenda wasn't finished. She pulled out her phone and began snapping pictures of me, my truck, my mailbox, anything that could be twisted into evidence for whatever fictional crime she was concocting. I ignored her and went inside. Later, reviewing my security cameras, I saw her linger for another 15 minutes, pacing at the edge of my property like a restless vulture. This wasn't about my truck anymore. It was about control, and the fact that I hadn't given her. The evening was quiet, but it was the tense quiet of a chess game where you know your opponent is plotting their next move. I poured myself a drink and watched the sunset, my dog stretched out at my feet, pondering whether to go nuclear or let her keep digging her own hole. Then, just after dark, my phone buzzed with a text from Mike, my neighbor 2 houses down. He sent a blurry picture taken through his blinds. Brenda, flashlight in hand, crouched near my hedges. I pulled up my own camera feed and saw her low to the ground, taking measurements of my lawn with what looked like a retractable tape measure. I stepped outside, and she froze like a child caught with her hand in the cookie jar. Lost again? I inquired. She straightened up, claiming she was documenting a violation for improper lawn edging. I couldn't help but laugh. If you want to keep this up, Brenda, I'd be happy to invite a real inspector to check your property too. She stormed off without another word. But I knew this could only go one way. She would escalate, until she either got her way or faced public humiliation. As I locked up for the night, a crucial realization dawned. Brenda believed she was playing a game of intimidation, where persistence would force my compliance. What she didn't know was that in my line of work, I'd been dealing with people just like her for years. I was patient, methodical, and perfectly content to let someone like her ensnare themselves with their own rope. But I wouldn't just wait anymore. If she wanted this to be a war, I would choose the battlefield. The next morning, I decided I was done reacting to Brenda's antics. If she wanted to escalate, fine, but from now on, I would be the one pulling the string. Before sunrise, I brewed a strong coffee, settled onto my porch with my dogs lounging at my feet, and began making a list. It wasn't a revenge list. Not yet. It was more of a pressure points list. I understood that people like Brenda thrived on control, but that control crumbled when their weaknesses were exposed. If I could uncover hers, I could make her think twice before banging on my door at 3 a.m. again. By 8 a.m., I had my first. My neighbor Mike ambled over, drawn by the smell of bacon from my skillet. He casually mentioned that Brenda was holding a special HOA board meeting later that afternoon. He'd heard it from his wife, who attended those meetings purely for the gossip. Apparently, the main agenda item was ongoing non-compliance issues with the property owner at Lot 17, which of course was me. Mike smirked. You should show up just to watch her face implode, he suggested. I had a better idea. If Brenda wanted to make me the main event, I'd ensure the whole neighborhood got a front row seat. First, I called the county clerk's office and inquired about our subdivision's HOA bylaws. The clerk was cheerful and efficient, emailing me a scanned copy within 15 minutes. Reading through it confirmed my suspicions. The HOA could only enforce rules voted on in a public meeting with proper notice, and they had zero authority to enter private property without permission. All her fines and votes against me were mere smoke and mirrors, empty threats designed to scare the uninformed. I printed the relevant pages and tucked them into a folder, ready for later. By the time the meeting started at 2 p.m., I was sitting in a folding chair right outside the community clubhouse. I wasn't on the agenda, but I didn't need to be. Residents trickled in, most giving me curious glances, some stopping to ask if the rumors about me blocking the sidewalk with a monster truck were true. I laughed and told them they'd see for themselves shortly. Brenda arrived in a flurry of perfume and self-importance, her yellow capris replaced by a stiff navy pantsuit, that made her look like she was heading to court. She spotted me immediately, her mouth tightening into a thin, angry line. Inside, she took the front table with the other board members, her clipboard laid out like it was the Constitution. She opened the meeting by announcing the HOA had grave concerns about safety hazards caused by certain residents. Then she launched into a slideshow. Yes, a slideshow of my driveway, my lawn, even my mailbox, each adorned with bright red circles and arrows pointing to imagined infractions. The sheer absurdity of it would have been hilarious if she weren't trying to rally the room into shaming me. Halfway through her third violation photo, I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked if I could have the floor for 2 minutes. She said no. I smiled, sat back down, and pulled out my phone. I dialed the county code enforcement officer who'd visited my property the day before, put him on speaker, and asked if he could clarify whether any of Brenda's presented issues were actual violations. He chuckled, loud enough for the entire room to hear, and said, "Nope, all clear." You could feel the energy shift in the room. A few neighbors chuckled. One of the board members rubbed his temple as if he'd suddenly developed a migraine. Brenda's eyes bored holes through me, but she didn't interrupt. When the meeting adjourned, I lingered, allowing neighbors to approach. A couple asked for copies of the bylaws I'd printed, which I happily handed out. Word spread quickly that Brenda's authority wasn't quite what she claimed. That alone would have been enough to rattle her, but I wasn't finished. I knew she'd attempt to reassert control, and I wanted her next move to be one she'd deeply regret. That opportunity arrived sooner than expected. At 6 p.m. that evening, as I was grilling dinner, I saw her marching up my driveway again. But this time she wasn't alone. She had 2 uniformed security guards from the HOA's private patrol service with her. They weren't police, but their cheap, rent-a-cop uniforms were designed to look official from a distance. She pointed at my truck and instructed them to document the obstruction for the record. One of the guards looked at me apologetically and asked if the vehicle was mine. "Yes," I said, "and it's on my private property." He nodded, took a quick photo, and whispered, "Sorry, she's persistent," before walking away. The other guard just shrugged and followed him. Brenda remained behind, glaring at me as if I'd personally stolen something from her. She informed me this was my last chance to comply before serious measures were taken. "Do those measures involve you kicking my door in at another ungodly hour?" I asked, because if so, the dogs are really looking forward to it. She sputtered something about reporting me higher up before storming off. I watched her go, wondering if she even realized how much leverage she was handing me. Every interaction was another documented incident of harassment, and the pile was growing taller. Later that night, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Mike. He'd just seen Brenda loading boxes into her car. Not moving boxes, but file boxes, crammed with paperwork. That told me she was frantically digging through HOA records, likely searching for some obscure clause to use against me. It also told me she was nervous. People like Brenda don't scramble like that unless they feel their grip slipping. That's when I decided to push things further. I sent an anonymous tip to a few other neighbors, subtly suggesting they request an audit of the HOA's recent fines and expenses. Nothing inflammatory, just a casual, "Hey, maybe we should make sure everything's above board." Within an hour I heard from Mike again. The block's group chat was exploding, with people asking tough questions about how fines were decided and where the money was going. Brenda, who had dictated the chat's tone for months, suddenly went silent. I slept better that night than I had all week, but not because I thought the fight was over. Quite the opposite. I knew the quiet was just the eye of the storm. Brenda wasn't the type to back down. She was the type to double down. And when she did, I planned to be ready, not just to defend myself, but to ensure that when she swung, she missed so spectacularly the entire neighborhood would witness it. The quiet didn't last long. By mid-morning the next day, I saw the first sign that Brenda had decided to swing. I stepped outside to grab the mail and found a fresh notice taped to my front door. This one was bright red in all caps, with final warning stamped across the top. The rest was a wall of legal-sounding nonsense about escalating violations and mandatory corrective action. The kicker was at the bottom. Failure to comply within 48 hours will result in HOA-initiated property access for remediation. In other words, she was threatening to enter my property herself and fix whatever she thought was wrong. My dogs must have sensed my blood pressure spike because they wandered over and pressed against my leg, as if reminding me they were more than ready for uninvited guests. I took the notice inside and added it to my growing Brenda file, right next to the hot pink one from her 3 a.m. visit and the fluorescent orange windshield sticker. As much as I wanted to confront her immediately, I knew better than to give her the satisfaction of a heated exchange. Instead, I made 2 phone calls. First to the sheriff's office, where I explained the situation and asked them to document the threat of illegal entry. The deputy I spoke with confirmed he knew exactly who I was talking about. Apparently, Brenda had quite a reputation, and he assured me they'd send someone if she tried anything. My second call was to my lawyer. He's a practical guy, not one to push for drama. But when I read him the wording on her final warning, he actually laughed. He told me to let her try because the legal fallout would be far more expensive for her than any fine she could dream up for me. I didn't have to wait long to see her next move. Around noon, Brenda arrived down the street in a caravan, her car in front, followed by 2 other HOA board members, and behind them a white pickup loaded with yard tools, garbage bags, and what looked like a gas-powered trimmer. They parked along the curb outside my house, and Brenda strutted up to my driveway in a wide-brimmed sun hat, like she was leading a landscaping parade. One of the board members looked utterly miserable. The other wore that eager-to-please expression of someone terrified of losing favor with her. I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand. "Are you lost?" I asked. Brenda announced loudly, for the benefit of anyone within earshot, that the HOA had determined my property was in breach of community aesthetic guidelines, and that they were here to correct the issues on my behalf. "You're trespassing," I stated, "and I've already called the sheriff." She scoffed, waving the final warning notice in the air like it was a royal decree. One of the board members hesitated, glancing nervously at the street, as if hoping a police cruiser might materialize and rescue him from the awkwardness. When they took a step toward my lawn, my dogs erupted from behind me, barking like they'd been training for this exact moment. Brenda flinched but tried to play it off, telling me to secure my animals so her crew could get to work. I didn't move. Instead, I walked down the steps and planted myself squarely between them and the grass. Calmly, I asked if she could cite the exact bylaw that granted her permission to enter my property without my consent. She faltered, flipping through the papers on her clipboard as if the answer might magically appear, before snapping that she didn't have to explain herself to a non-compliant owner. That's when the sheriff's deputy pulled up. He got out slowly, assessing the scene, and asked what the problem was. Brenda immediately launched into a rambling speech about habitual violations and property values under siege, pointing at my perfectly mowed lawn and clean driveway as if they were evidence of urban decay. The deputy let her talk herself into a corner, then turned to me. "Do you want them removed?" he asked. "Yes," I confirmed. He told Brenda and her crew in no uncertain terms that they had no legal right to be on my property without a court order, and if they returned uninvited, they could face trespassing charges. Her face turned red enough to match her final warning notice. She tried to argue, but the deputy cut her off, telling her she could file a civil complaint if she thought she had a case. Otherwise, she needed to leave. The caravan left in a huff, Brenda's tires squealing as she turned onto the main road. I figured she'd sulk for the rest of the day, but I severely underestimated her capacity for self-sabotage. That evening, I noticed unfamiliar cars parked around the neighborhood. By 8 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Mike. "Brenda's got a whole meeting going in her garage." Curious, I checked my security cameras and saw a steady stream of people heading into her open garage, where folding chairs were set up in rows facing a projector screen. I could only imagine her presentation, probably a greatest hits compilation of my driveway from every possible angle. An hour later, Mike texted again. "She's saying you're a danger to the community." That's when I decided it was time for a little counter-programming. I put together a quick PDF, the sheriff's incident report from earlier, a copy of the relevant HOA bylaws, and a few choice stills from my security footage, showing Brenda trespassing on my lawn with yard tools in hand. Then I emailed it, anonymously of course, to a handful of neighbors I knew were on the fence about her. Within 15 minutes, my phone lit up with messages from people laughing, asking if I'd seen the evidence. Word spread fast, and I knew by morning that whatever momentum she thought she was building in her garage would be utterly gone. But Brenda wasn't just stubborn, she was desperate now. The following afternoon, I caught her creeping along the side of my house, her phone held high, clearly trying to record something through my windows. I stepped outside before she got too close, and she jumped back as if I'd caught her stealing. She mumbled something about documenting property hazards and speed walked away. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. My cameras caught every second, and I had a feeling she'd just given me exactly what I needed to turn this entire battle in my favor. That night I called my lawyer again. We discussed the pattern of harassment, the trespassing incidents, and the bogus fines. He suggested a formal cease and desist letter, but I had something better in mind. I wanted her to keep coming, to keep overreaching, until even her most loyal supporters couldn't defend her. And then at the perfect moment, I'd drop everything, photos, videos, recordings and the sheriff's reports, into the laps of the entire HOA membership. Over the next 2 days I barely had to lift a finger. Brenda provided me with more ammunition than I could have ever planned for. She left another neon notice on my door, this one claiming I was in violation for failure to maintain mailbox paint consistency with neighborhood palette. She staged a bizarre inspection of my lawn from across the street, narrating into her phone like she was filming a nature documentary about invasive species. She even stopped the mail carrier one morning to demand they confirm my mailbox measurement. Each incident went straight into my growing archive. Saturday morning dawned bright and quiet, the kind of day where normal people think about coffee, yard work, maybe a leisurely stroll around the block. Brenda, of course, thought about war. By 9 a.m. she was marching down the street in a crisp white linen blouse, sunglasses and a clipboard so overstuffed with papers, it looked like it was about to explode. Behind her trailed 3 HOA board members, clearly drafted into whatever scheme she'd cooked up overnight. The sight of her little entourage gave me a feeling I hadn't had since my chess tournament days. This was the final match, and I already knew the end game. I didn't wait for her to knock. I stepped onto the porch, coffee mug in hand. "Another one of your emergency inspections, Brenda?" I asked. She didn't smile. She announced in a voice loud enough for the neighbors watering their lawns to hear that the HOA had officially voted to begin corrective property action against me. The phrase was vague on purpose, designed to sound ominous without actually meaning anything. "Was that vote documented in the official minutes?" I asked, just as loudly. She hesitated for the briefest moment before declaring that the minutes were not available to the public yet. The pause didn't go unnoticed by the onlooker. Right on cue, Mike ambled over from across the street, phone out, pretending to check a text. "What's going on?" he asked, feigning curiosity. Brenda puffed up and began reciting a list of my so-called violations: obstructed driveway sidelines, non-regulation lawn edging, and my personal favorite, failure to conform to community mailbox paint standard. Mike looked at my mailbox, then back at her, then calmly said, "Looks fine to me," in a tone that made a couple of neighbors chuckle. Brenda's face tightened. She ordered one of the board members to record the obstruction, but the poor guy just took a half-hearted photo of my driveway and muttered something about needing to get to work. That was my moment. I told her that before she went any further, I wanted to make sure everyone here understood the real rules. I went inside and came back with a neat binder. The Brenda. Inside were every bogus notice she'd left on my door, screenshots from my security cameras, sheriff's reports, and printouts of the actual HOA bylaws. I handed a few copies to the neighbors who'd gathered, making sure they got the pages where the bylaws explicitly prohibited unauthorized entry or fines, without proper vote. Brenda's voice grew sharper, more frantic, as she tried to talk over me. She accused me of misinterpreting the bylaws, but the more she talked, the more she sounded like someone who was used to never being challenged. Then I played my A. I pulled out a USB stick and told her and everyone within earshot that I'd be presenting a short video at the upcoming HOA general meeting. The video would feature clips from my security cameras paired with the corresponding dates and times from the sheriff's reports, showing every instance of her trespassing, harassing, and attempting unauthorized property entry. I said it calmly, almost cheerfully, like I was announcing a bake sale. The reaction was immediate. The board members exchanged worried looks. A few neighbors raised their eyebrows. Brenda's lips pressed together so hard they almost vanished. She tried to recover, claiming I was misrepresenting her actions, and that everything she'd done was in the name of community safety. But the problem for her was that people had already started whispering to each other. And once neighbors start doubting, the spell of HOA authority breaks faster than a cheap lock. I could see the calculation in her eyes. If she backed down now, she'd look weak. If she doubled down, she'd risk even more public embarrassment. And Brenda wasn't built to retreat. She chose to double down. On Monday evening, the HOA general meeting took place at the community clubhouse. It was usually a snooze fest, budget updates, landscaping contracts, that sort of thing. But that night, the place was packed. Word had spread about the video, and people wanted to see it. Brenda was at the front table, dressed in a blazer as if she were about to argue a Supreme Court case. She opened the meeting with her usual dominance, setting the agenda and announcing disciplinary discussions for chronic violators. When the floor opened for resident comments, the room quieted. I stated I had evidence relevant to recent enforcement actions and wished to share it for transparency's sake. There was some shuffling among the board, but a couple of members, probably tired of being dragged into her fights, nodded their agreement. I walked up, plugged in the USB stick, and hit play. The screen filled with crystal clear footage. Brenda slapping neon notices on my door at night. Brenda creeping along my hedges with a tape measure. Brenda trying to peer into my windows. Brenda arriving with yard tools and 2 reluctant members. Brenda calling in a tow truck for a perfectly parked truck. Each clip was time-stamped, with the corresponding sheriff's incident number in the corner. There was no narration from me, no commentary, just the images and the undeniable. The room started murmuring before the first minute was up. By the time the final clip rolled, showing the deputy telling her to leave my property, the murmuring had turned into low laughter, not the mean kind, but the kind that says, "We can't believe we've been letting this person run the show." When the lights came back on, Brenda tried to launch into damage control. She claimed the footage was taken out of context, that I was editing events to smear her, that I was undermining community cohesion, but nobody was nodding along anymore. Even her 2 most loyal allies on the board looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Then came the final, unplanned blow. One of the neighbors, a retired attorney named Thompson, stood up and calmly informed the room that based on the bylaws and the evidence just shown, Brenda's actions could constitute harassment and abuse of authority. She proposed a motion to hold a special election for HOA president. The place erupted, not in shouting, but in an almost giddy buzz, like the first day of spring after a long winter. The board members glanced at each other, and one of them, clearly seizing the chance to save face, seconded the motion. A vote was set for the following month. Brenda left the meeting without a word. No dramatic exit, no parting shot, just a tight-jawed walk to her car, her shoulders stiff, and her gaze fixed straight ahead. I knew it wasn't completely over, but her armor had been cracked in front of everyone who mattered. Over the next few weeks, the energy in the neighborhood shifted. People who'd been intimidated by her started chatting in driveways, comparing stories, trading copies of the bylaws. The special election became the talk of the block. I stayed mostly quiet, letting others carry the momentum, but I made sure to answer any questions with a calm smile and a reference to public record. When the day of the vote came, it wasn't even close. Brenda was out. One of the quieter, more reasonable board members stepped into the role, and the first thing they did was pass a motion to nullify every fine and warning she'd issued over the past 6 months. There was polite applause from the crowd, but I noticed more than a few people looking over at me, grinning.